Have you ever heard of a town that had to be evacuated? Not because of a fire, a flood, or some chemical spill, but because of something else. Something that defied explanation. Today we're going to talk about a place that has been almost entirely scrubbed from public records. A ghost town with a story so chilling, it's whispered about in hushed tones by those who live nearby. This is the story of Honolulu, Utah, and the 72 hours that sealed its fate forever. Our story begins in the dead of night, at 3:17 a.m. on a wind-scoured August night in 1996. Honolulu was a tiny mining town, home to just 200 souls, nestled deep in the vast, red desert of Utah. At that exact moment, every single light in the town flickered once, and then plunged the entire community into an unnerving, absolute darkness. But the silence that followed was even more terrifying. From the desolate desert landscape, a voice began to call out. It wasn't just any voice. Every single resident of Honolulu heard their own name being called, and the voice was a perfect, flawless imitation of the person they loved the most in the world. Imagine it. You're in total darkness and you hear your spouse, your child, or your parent calling for you from out in the wild, empty desert. It was a chilling, collective experience that set the stage for the horrors to come. The strangeness didn't start with the voices, though. The first sign that something was deeply wrong in Honolulu had appeared a few days earlier. It began with something as simple as a lost sheepdog. The dog had wandered off into the desert and was missing for a couple of days. When it finally returned, its owner was relieved, but that relief quickly turned to ice-cold dread. The dog was the same, but its eyes were disturbingly, unnervingly human. It looked at people with an intelligence and an ancient malice that had no place in a family pet. This was just the beginning. Soon other animals began to act strangely, their behaviors twisting into unsettling parodies of what they once were. It was as if the very soul of the town was being quietly, insidiously corrupted. But the real terror, the event that pushed the town from unease into outright panic, began when things started walking the streets. These weren't people. They were described as tall, thin, and just wrong. Their proportions were off, their movements jerky and unnatural, and the most horrifying part, they wore the faces of the dead, not masks, but the actual, living, breathing faces of deceased loved ones. A son would see his father who had passed away years ago, walking down the main street. A woman would see her sister, lost to illness, staring back at her from across a yard. These entities were parading through the town, wearing the skin of cherished memories, turning love and grief into weapons of pure fear. The psychological toll was immediate and devastating. The residents tried to fight back. One of the town's oldest residents, a man named Old Man Jenkins, was a stubborn nonsense type. When he saw one of these tall, thin shapes standing on his porch, a shape that looked disturbingly like his late wife, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his double-barreled shotgun and fired both barrels directly into it. But the creature didn't fall. It didn't scream or bleed. It simply stood there, and then it laughed. And the laugh that echoed through the night was the sweet, familiar laugh of his dead wife. The sound shattered him, breaking something deep inside. How do you fight something that wears the face of your dearest memories and mocks you with their voice? The horror wasn't confined to the streets. It began to seep into the homes, violating the sanctity of the one place people thought they were safe. Children, the most vulnerable among them, began waking up screaming in the middle of the night. When their terrified parents rushed in, they'd find the outside of their bedroom windows smeared with handprints. But these weren't human prints. The fingers were too long, too thin, stretched into grotesque, spider-like digits that couldn't belong to any known creature. The prints were a silent, chilling message. We can see you. We are right outside, and we can almost reach you. The feeling of being constantly watched, of being hunted in your own home, became unbearable. Desperate and out of options, the townspeople turned to the wisdom of the old ways. They called in a respected Navajo shaman from a nearby reservation, hoping he could explain or perhaps even combat the evil that had descended upon their town. The shaman was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of ancient knowledge. When he arrived, the town elders took him to the church, the one place they believed should be a sanctuary. Claw marks, deep and vicious, circled the entire building, gouged into the wood and stone. The shaman took one long hard look at the marks at the desecrated holy ground, and his expression grew grim. He turned to the anxious faces watching him and spoke a single, chilling phrase in his native tongue. Yinald Lucy has come to collect. For those who didn't know, Yinald Lucy is the Navajo name for a skinwalker, a malevolent witch who can shapeshift into animals. But in this context, the meaning was far more sinister. It wasn't just a creature, it was a collector. It had come for something. The situation escalated beyond local control. The federal government had to get involved. Within 72 hours of the shaman's pronouncement, the entire town of 200 souls was given a mandatory evacuation order. National Guard trucks rolled into the dusty streets of Honolulu, not to fight an enemy of flesh and blood, but to rescue a populace from an unseen, unknowable terror. By the time they arrived, the town had descended into a surreal nightmare. Half of the livestock in the area had been torn apart, their bodies mutilated with savage force. Yet strangely, None of the meat was eaten. It was killing for sport, for terror. Car engines would start by themselves at all hours, their headlights cutting through the darkness like accusatory eyes. And perhaps most unnervingly, every single telephone in town began to ring at once. If you dared to pick one up, you wouldn't hear a voice, a dial tone, or even static. All you would hear was breathing, a slow, raspy, inhuman breath on the other end of the line. Listening, the residents were forced to abandon everything. They left with only the clothes on their backs, fleeing their homes, their possessions, and their entire lives. They became refugees from their own reality, haunted by what they had seen, heard, and felt. Some of the braver, or perhaps more foolish, residents tried to return months later. They hoped that whatever had taken over their town had moved on. But what they found was a final, deeply personal act of psychological warfare. Inside their abandoned homes, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, untouched, except for their family photos. Every photograph had been rearranged, and on every single picture, the faces had been meticulously scratched out, all except for the eyes. The eyes were left untouched, staring out from the defaced images, a permanent, haunting gaze. It was a clear message. We know who you are, we remember you, and we are still watching. Honolulu was officially declared uninhabitable, cordoned off and left to be reclaimed by the desert. To this day, it remains an empty, forbidden place. The story, however, lives on. Locals who live in the surrounding areas have a warning for anyone who gets too curious, for anyone who thinks about driving down that old, forgotten road at night. They swear that if you drive past the rusted, bullet-ridden sign that still reads "Welcome to Honolulu," you should turn off your radio and just listen. They say you can still hear voices on the wind, whispering from the empty windows of the abandoned houses. Not just one voice, but 200 familiar voices. And they all seem to be whispering your name, begging you to come closer, promising that they've missed you, that they've been waiting for you to come home. The official story is a gas leak, or maybe a contaminated water source. But those who know, those who remember, understand the truth. Whatever it was that came to Honolulu that summer, whatever it was that wore the skins of their dead and laughed with their voices, it never left. The town may be empty of people, but it's not empty of life. And after all these years, it's still hungry. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as chilling as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the shadows. And let me know in the comments below, what would you do if you heard a loved one's voice calling you from the dark? Until next time, stay safe out there.